are the tools and the vassals of the rich behind the scenes. We are marionettes. These men pull the strings and we dance. Our time, our talents, our lives, our capacities are all the property of these men. During the mid-70s, the Club of Rome had indeed divided the world into 10 kingdoms. Now, Brzezinski himself was an ardent follower. I swear he was a #1 fan of none other than Karl Marx himself, telling him what to do. Remember, Brzezinski did become his national security advisor because his masters in the order of the Illuminati told him that's what he was going to do. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the third DVD in a whole brand new series entitled Secrets of the Illuminati. The third part of this series is called Frontmen of the Illuminati. Now, over the years, one of the many things I have been asked as a former Illuminist was, how can we tell if any organization in particular is that of the Illuminati? Are there any things in particular we need to look at to figure this out? Well, there are three things that give the Illuminati their incredible power. That is money, their politics, and their religion. Combine these three things together and you have an almost indomitable force. Now, the interesting thing about all these things that make up and allow the Illuminati their power is that it's actually been prophesied in the Bible in many places, in particular in the book of Revelation. Now, when we start looking at the Bible, we will find out that there is a roadmap to follow concerning the prophecies. And when we compare these prophecies to what's going on nowadays in the Illuminati, you will find out that they do line up. Now, in a previous DVD within this tape series, we had gone over a particular card game that the Illuminati had created to make it look like when anyone mentioned the name Illuminati, well, you must have just been talking about a simple card game. Now, that card game that we are talking about is the Illuminati's New World Order card game. Now, the interesting thing about these cards, and you can immediately tell just by looking at the back, there are 450 cards to the complete deck. Unfortunately, I do not possess all the cards of this card game, and it's not a card game. And it's come to my understanding that this has even been expanded. There are new ones. We are going to look at these cards in light of the Bible now and see if they are aware of biblical prophecy and see if they are actually preparing for these events. Now, one of the first cards I've come across when dealing with these new cards, the Illuminati's New World Order cards, when looking at the Illuminati cards, they tell a very interesting story. The first one I'd like you to take a look at is this one. It's called Tape Runs Out. Over here it says, when the rapture comes, I'll make them wait. And if you note, the earth is being destroyed. Now, we know that, according to the book of Revelation, the earth literally will be put on the brink of total destruction. And if it wasn't for the mercy and grace of God, the earth would indeed be destroyed. In their arrogance, the Illuminati actually believes that they'll be able to delay the inevitable, that the rapture will indeed hit. Now, there are three major schools pertaining to the Illuminati, pertaining to the rapture. They believe, in theology, that the rapture will either happen before the tribulation, during the middle of the tribulation, or directly after the tribulation. This is known as the pre-trib, the mid-trib, and the post-trib perspective. Whichever belief you hold to, one thing is true. If you're a born-again Christian, if you've been saved, well, no matter what happens, you're going to end up in God's glory in His heaven at the end. When we pick this up in the book of Revelation, starting in chapter 6, we find out that there are going to be 4 horsemen. And what you need to note is that the first one is going to be riding upon a pale horse. It says, "And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard, as it were, the noise of thunder, one of the 4 beasts saying, 'Come and see.' And I saw, and behold, a white horse." Now, the order of events state that there are going to be great amounts of death that will happen very swiftly, almost as if it happened overnight. And according to the Bible, the description of the sword is, well, I should say, out of the original language, the Greek, the word that was used for the prime weapon was Marquis. It's a particular Roman short sword that was very fast and could deliver a very deadly blow like that. Now, that's not to say that when these events transpires, they're going to be using this sword. No. Marquis' sword was used in this context to denote how swift and how speedily all these deaths are going to happen. And that as time goes by, and we can even begin to see the pre-signs, if you would, or the pre-warnings that these events are coming about, because here we see the collapse of the economy. And it is so bad, according to the scriptures, and this is in chapter 6, that it will cost a full day's wages just to buy a loaf of bread. That's how bad the economy is going to end up. And of course, as a result, we know that world hunger will come about. There will be a worldwide hunger. There's going to be a shortage of food. And it's interesting how all these cards, and you'll note how these cards are going along and are lining up with biblical prophecies. Many of the events that will happen and come about because of hunger center around plagues, diseases, and deaths. These things are the natural result, unfortunately, of worldwide hunger. And of course, many of these diseases have been created in our own labs. We've created many of these different diseases and such. And as a result, we are going to end up with so many different epidemics and pandemics that literally people will be dropping by the millions as a result. As we go along in the scriptures, we find out that the 4 beasts of the apocalypse, the red rider becomes impatient. He doesn't want to wait. He wants to go out and kill. And we find out, according to the translation, it's what's known as the Frontmen sword. This is a very deadly blade. It gives an immediate death blow. It's not a merciful sword. It delivers an immediate death blow. And it's interesting that those people that this will probably be used on more than anyone else, and remember, this is symbolic now, but the end result, they're not. There's going to be literally millions upon millions of Christian martyrs that will be beheaded during this period of time. The scriptures makes it very clear that these Christians are beheaded for the cause of Christ. And it's very interesting how, again, with the Illuminati cards, it shows that there are indeed going to be martyrs, and that the method of execution, as shown on this side of the cards, will be the guillotine. And to this very day, let's face it, ladies and gentlemen, we have heard, and I have been receiving reports constantly of how these portable guillotines are being shipped via trucks and through railroad boxcars throughout various military bases within this country. And a chain of cataclysmic global events are going to happen. When looking at the prophecies found in the book of Revelation, we find out, among other things, that nature itself is going to rise up in rebellion against mankind. And these are just part of the overall punishment that God's going to deem upon the face of the earth. And one of the first things you will note is that there is going to be a great earthquake. Now this great earthquake is going to be so horrific in its power and strength that it will actually destroy part of the area where King Solomon's temple had resided. Among other things that will happen, the Bible tells us that there's going to be an eclipse, that there is going to be total darkness upon the face of the earth for a season. And what's also interesting is that there are going to be two giant mountain-type like structures that are going to come out of outer space and strike the face of the earth. Most biblical apologists will tell you that these are going to be meteors or asteroids. And the effects of anything that big is going to cause worldwide calamities, to say the least. One of the immediate effects you will note when something that big strikes the face of the earth are going to be tidal waves. Some of these tidal waves are literally going to be hundreds, if not almost 1,000 feet tall. The amount of damage that will be done just to the shorelines throughout the world will be incredible, to say the least. The Bible also tells us that there are going to be great winds that will be striking all over the earth. Now these great winds will be the result, as far as I can tell, and interesting enough, by these cards, by hurricanes and tornadoes. And these are, of course, natural events that occur. However, these are going to be unnatural in their size and in their power because they're going to strike all over the earth. Interesting enough, it also says that there's going to be great fires around the earth and causing, great darkness in the clouds and the heavens. The moon itself is also going to appear to be blood red. Now there's only two things, at least that I'm aware of, that can cause the moon to appear to be blood red. One is a volcano, because volcanoes can throw up vast amounts, literally millions of tons, of soot and ash into the air, which will refract the sun's natural colors and make the moon appear to be as if it's red. And one other thing, it also says that the mountains of the earth are going to be shaken and torn out of their natural positions. The only thing I'm aware of, at least on this earth, that could pack that type of devastating punch are nuclear bombs. Now, in Ezekiel, there does appear to be, when we look at the description and compare it to what really happens with the nuclear detonations, it really does appear to be describing a nuclear detonation, in that, as far as I know, unless it's an immediate, direct thing of God, The only thing I know of that we have that could possibly shake or dislodge a mountain from its natural base would be a nuclear bomb. Now, all these horrific punishments are going to be hitting the face of the earth. People are desperately going to be running around looking for answers. Who can solve all these problems? Who can bring peace back to our world and to our minds and to our hearts? And out of nowhere, according to the scriptures, and once again, according to these Illuminati cards, they are preparing, the Illuminati right now, they are preparing within their own ranks a person, a charismatic leader, in fact, who will be able to wow the masses with just his words and his very presence. He will appear out of nowhere, and he will be a person who will be able to solve all the problems of all the earth seemingly like that. This man is going to be so charismatic and so popular that eventually he is going to be hailed as the world's new Messiah. Now, we know that according to Revelation chapter 13, this is none other than the Antichrist. And this is how he will appear on the face of the earth. He's going to come in as a lamb, a peaceful, gentle creature who will be there to help us solve all our problems. But eventually, we see his true nature as he starts creating devastating effects himself and eventually wars. Now, it's interesting that when we take a look at the book of Revelation and compare it with the books of Matthew chapter 24, the book of Mark chapter 13, and the book of Luke 21, we find out that every event that we're talking about and covering are also mentioned in those three other books. Revelation will verify what I've just stated, and interesting enough how the Illuminati cards also predicts these events. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke will also reference these same events. And the book of Revelation, which was given, which was written by Jesus Christ, was given directly to John, who we would automatically associate with the first four Gospels. So in essence, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the book of Revelation all verified these events. Now, one thing I want everyone to take note of. When we look at all these punishments that literally is happening globally speaking, there is a pattern to be followed. First, when we look at Revelation 8:7, we find that there is hail and fire mingled with blood that's coming down and striking the earth. The Bible clearly points out that a third of all the trees and all green grass are going to be destroyed. Now, this is a result of fire. Revelation 8:9, we just saw that there's going to be a great mountain, probably a meteor or an asteroid, that's burning with fire that will hit the land itself, the waters and everything else. And as a result, a third of all sea water, a third of all sea life, a third of all sailing vessels are destroyed. Again, the common thread here is that this is a burning fire, a mountain of fire, according to John's description. And then there's going to be another meteor-like object John describes as a great fire, and this will be thrown into the fresh waters, and they are made poisonous, so that tens of thousands also are going to die. And again, this great meteor that's on fire and such, again, we're looking at an object of fire. Revelation Revelation chapter 8, verses 5 through 12. Once the hail and fire mingled with blood happens, mankind, literally, his sins, if we look at fire, mankind's sins is being purged away through fire. And fire, symbolically speaking, has always been the agent of purification, symbolically speaking. We find this is true because there's going to be hail and fire, that there's going to be two great mountains, burning as it were with fire. We find out at the end of the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 19, verse 20, that Satan's sinful leaders are also going to be purged because they end up in the lake of fire automatically. Revelation 20, verse 9, Satan's sinful followers are also going to be purged. Their sins are going to be purged from the face of the earth. We find out how, because fire from heaven comes down and destroys them as they dare to attack Christ on his throne in the city of David. The last one in this common thread is that Satan himself is eventually going to be purged on his entire sinful effect, and all that he's done upon the face of the earth is also going to be purged through fire, because he himself will be judged and eventually thrown into the lake of fire. Now, one last thing I would like to show you, and to clarify these things, because so many people have asked me once I began teaching the book of Revelation, what are those things that identify the Antichrist? What are his qualifications? Are there any telltale signs? There are a couple of them in the Bible, and we need to just look at them quickly. One of those things that identify immediately the Antichrist is that he's going to be a male person. Revelation chapter 13 verifies this, and Daniel chapter 11 verse 36 will verify this. We find out through Daniel 11:36 that this Antichrist figure is going to be Jewish. We also find out, interesting enough, that Daniel in 11:37 states that he is going to be a virgin. He is not going to have any relations with women. Now, some people say, well, that means he's gay. No. You have to understand Jewish tradition in order to understand what Daniel's saying here. See, it's always been believed that to this day that some Jewish lady can still give birth to the Messiah. They do not accept that Jesus Christ was the Messiah. So they believe to this very day that some young lady can still give birth to the Messiah. This Antichrist figure is not going to have any relations with women, because his Jewish belief has taught him that any woman could still bear the Messiah, and he's not going to run the risk of giving birth to a person who could eventually end up destroying him. Now, Revelation 13:6 tells us that this Antichrist figure is going to openly blaspheme God and his holy word. And we find out that eventually this Antichrist figure just becomes completely anti-Christian. This is what we're looking for when we're trying to identify who this Antichrist figure is going to be. We also find out that when studying the Bible, he is going to come out of one of the European common nations, and that at first he's just going to be a politically unknown individual. He's just going to be one of those people somehow that's just going to have seemingly an overnight meteoric rise to success. As I said before, when examining and looking at the Illuminati, the three things that give them their power: their almost limitless amount of money, their politics, and their religion, which is Luciferian witchcraft. When we look at Revelations chapter 17 and 18, you will find all three of those things are prophesied there. They are, if you just examine them in any type of theology, you'll notice that they are identified as ecclesiastical Babylon, political Babylon, and religious Babylon. So what we're going to do now, we are going to get into the 6 major front organizations that the Illuminati created so that their new world order would be thrust upon mankind. And the 3 things we need to look at: do they reflect the Illuminati's money, their political stance, and their religion? And are they interlocked and connected? If these answers are true, then I guarantee you these organizations are definitely headed funded and run by the Order of the Illuminati. So without any further ado, let's get into and examine the 6 frontmen of the Illuminati. The first front organization that we will be examining that was created by the organization of the Illuminati is known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs. As you should be well aware by now, in other DVDs in this series, we have already talked about how the Illuminati was created back on May 1st, 1776 under Dr. Adam Weishaupt. It was a number of years later, somewhere around 1782, 1783, that there was approximately 600 members that had been put into the Order of the Illuminati. Now, these were not just ordinary members. These were people of letters. In other words, they had a great education. They had political influence because of their rank. Many of them were members of nobility. Many had high seats of powers throughout the government and monarchies. And they also had vast wealth, their own personal wealth, I should say. And all these things fit in perfectly as far as these individuals were concerned once they joined the Illuminati and their religious perspective. Now, Weishaupt himself may have been, as I've always said, an organizational genius when it came to the Order of the Illuminati, how he created it, their belief system and everything, but it was really Baron Adolf von Koenig, once he was brought into the Order of the Illuminati, that the Illuminati really began to flourish. By the time 1789 had come about, more than 2,000 of the wealthiest, most politically influential members of nobility and the government were in the Order of the Illuminati. This same pattern is repeated throughout history. The 3 things, as I stated earlier, that grant the Illuminati their incredible power is their money, their politics, and their religion. Now, if these 6 organizations, which we're going to discuss right now, have these 3 things in common, and if they are indeed interlocked, then there is no other conclusion we can come to. They are indeed the 6 frontmen, or the 6 front organizations of the Order of the Illuminati. Now, it was back in 1919, shortly after World War I, the Earth was becoming a much smaller place. It was because of this that the Order of the Illuminati would really be able to begin to extend their power globally. Now, this building here is known as Chatham House. Chatham House is located on 10th Street, James Square in London. Now, it's here, and I want you to just get a good look at this. The front door, it says Chatham House. There's no doubt about, that this is exactly what that building says it is. Inside Chatham House was the very first of the 6 front organizations the Illuminati would create. The first one is known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs. This particular front organization was started by Cecil B. Rhodes. Historically speaking, many people would know that name immediately. He was the man who made multi-millions of dollars in the diamond industry in Africa. At one point, he himself controlled 90% of all the diamonds that flowed from that country. The Chatham House rules, and it's interesting, they do have rules on how they're going to govern all their meetings. First of all, everyone would be allowed free speech. You could say whatever you want to without any problem, and you wouldn't have to worry about any of the information getting out. In other words, every meeting would be strictly confidential, and no one would be allowed to say anything about what they discuss. They try to say, well, these things are off the records, but we'll see. Three of the big things that they discuss, among number of items that they will discuss, will be politics, business, and security. And when I say security, I'm talking about just not just national security, but also international. Because remember, the world at this time was becoming much smaller, so they were going to have to concern themselves about everything now on a global basis. What's interesting is that they actually print 2 magazines. The first one is known as International Affairs. International Affairs, if you will notice, is one of the was the very first magazine that they put out on a regular basis. The next one that they themselves had also started is called The World. Both magazines cover a number of various topics and discussions, but they can be labeled under 9 specific categories. Now, interesting enough, I believe we may have mentioned Maurice Strong in the past. Maurice Strong is one of the most politically influential power brokers in the world. I mean, whenever Maurice Strong speaks, everyone listens. And I can tell you from personal experience, this man is in the order of the Illuminati. And it's no small wonder at that point how he himself became so wealthy and has so much political influence and clout. Now, they do have a number of people who are invited to come and speak at the Royal Institute of International Affairs. They have guest speakers who will be speaking on various topics and discussions. And what immediately tells me, as far as the true nature of these people, are the people that they let speak there. In other words, you can always tell if a person's guilty through association or not. Now in this case, and this is what amazes me, on July 15th, 1997, the guest speaker at the Royal Institute of International Affairs at Chatham House was none other than the butcher of Baghdad himself, Yasser Arafat. I still cannot get over the fact that he was actually allowed to set foot in England, my hometown, after he himself had been responsible for millions of his own people being murdered. I mean, I'm still gobsmacked over the fact that he was not arrested on the spot and tried for crimes against humanity. Now, as I said before, a number of the things that the Royal Institute of International Affairs had that they had spoken about in the past can be labeled under 9 specific categories. Now, it's taken me 12 to 15 years just to gather up all the different topics of discussions that have been brought up at the Royal Institute of International Affairs. And when I took a look at all the different topics and broke them down according to their category, about 50% of them fell into the range of the 3 things that give the Order of the Illuminati their great power. That is money, politics, and religion. Here, and I will just hold this up just long enough so that you may be able to pause the DVD long enough and maybe make a copy and look these things up for yourself, because they really are quite interesting as far as how far the effect goes and just how much it's going to affect you as an individual. As I said before, the 3 things that give them their power will be money, politics, and religion. And on this next one, if we look over here, we have another column which involves both money and politics. And of course, the next column will be energy, and then the last one, column 6, will be on the military. In other words, they examine arms, how many people should be in the armed forces, their overall effect, their plans for these armed forces in the future, so on and so forth. And then the last 3 columns over here is just general things that I labeled as potpourri. They didn't fall in any of the other 8 categories. Then we have one other section here with religion. And then the last one here would have been different nations that are involved in their discussions. When we look into the Royal Institute of International Affairs and their, what they're teaching, their magazines and everything else, it's very obvious that the 3 major things that they're always espousing is religion, politics, and money. And these are the exact 3 things that give the Order of the Illuminati their vast power. In short, these 3 things are lining up exactly with Revelations chapters 17 and 18. They are aligning up with what we find out with the Illuminati card, and they also obviously align perfectly with the Illuminati's belief system. So what we're going to do, we're going to end this here for now, and we're going to go into the second front organization of the Illuminati and see if their belief system, the 3 major things, line up with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and we're going to see if they are interlocked and connected as part of a whole organization or part of a whole body. Over in England, during the 1980s, the Prime Minister was Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher, for me, was one of my favorite Prime Ministers ever since Sir Winston Churchill. Margaret, as we're saying, she was a tour de force. No one could go up against her. Unless, of course, you were the Queen of England. These 2 ladies constantly seemed to be butting heads. But the one thing they both did agree upon was that they would not allow the European Common Unit into England. They realized that if they allowed the money of the ECU into England, then England would lose her national sovereignty. And Margaret was adamant about this, that it would not happen. The problem is, the powers that be, the powers in London, just like throughout the rest of the world, the Illuminati, decided that they had to get rid of her. She was not cooperating, politically speaking, with their goals and plans. So, in what appeared to be an overnight coup, Margaret's own party, which put her into a power, threw her out and put John Majors in instead. And John Majors was one of the worst prime ministers, as far as I'm concerned, that England's had for over a century. You can fire a prime minister, but you can't fire the Queen of England. If nothing else, very few people could even stand up against this lady. And she's not tall, but my goodness, what a presence that lady has. Because of the overwhelming power of the Illuminati, we see them pushing the European Common Unit throughout Europe. They're trying to unite Europe under one banner through money. But this is not something that could be happened overnight. They had to first start with trying to change people's ideas. And the easiest way to do this is through newspapers and magazines, things like that, things that people had picked up and could be easily influenced. Now, it was back in 1915, once again on the auspices of J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan himself was one of the wealthiest, one of the most influential people on the earth. I mean, this man eventually became identified not just with money, but with the newspapers. And we'll get into that in just a section. One of the earliest places that J.P. Morgan had started off with was right here. This was known as J.M. Bow and Morgan, and this would have been back in 1872. This was the first company that they had started. It was the J.M. Bow, Morgan and Company building. This is a very, very old photo, and as you can see, you know, right here at the bottom, this is the whole thing that they themselves had controlled. They started off, you know, in a very nice building, I'll tell you. Even then, his influence and money had rapidly began to grow. And eventually, J.P. Morgan, you know, went up to bigger and better things, because by the time 1914 had come about, this was a building where J.P. Morgan Company was located. And nowadays, almost a century later, we now have J.P. Morgan Chase Tower. And this one is located in Dallas, Texas. And as I recall, this one was built in 1987. I mean, he's gone from that one-story building, and the family literally has had, you know, quite a meteoric rise. Now, as I said before, J.P. Morgan would eventually become associated with newspapers and such, because in order to affect America and our beliefs, the Illuminati had to affect us in such a way that it would seem as if it was our idea and that nothing was going on. Now, I'm going to read something from the official congressional records, page 2947, for those who are referencing this, and it was dated February 9th, 1997. Now, the following statement was made by Congressman Callaway. Now, listen very carefully to this. Mr. Chairman, under unanimous consent, I insert in the record at this point a statement showing the newspaper combination which explains there in this matter just discussed by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, and he was talking about Mr. Moore. In March 1914, the J.P. Morgan interest, the steel shipping building, and powder interest in their subsidiary organizations got together 12 men high up in the newspaper world and employed them to select the most influential newspapers in the United States, and sufficient number of them to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. These 12 men worked the problem out by selecting 179 newspapers and then began by an elimination process to retain only those necessary for the purpose of controlling the general policy of the daily press throughout the country. They found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest newspapers. The 25 papers were agreed upon. Emissaries were sent to purchase the policy, national and international, of those papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought to be paid up by the month. An editor was furnished with each paper to properly supervise and edit information regarding the questions of preparedness, militarism, financial policies, and other things of national and international nature considered vital to the interests of the purchasers. This contract is in existence at this present time, and it accounts for the news columns of the daily press of the country being filled with all sorts of preparedness arguments and misrepresentations as to the present condition of the United States Army and Navy and the possibility of the United States being attacked by foreign foes. This policy also included the suppression of everything in opposition to the wishes of the interests served. The effectiveness of this scheme has been conclusively demonstrated by the character of stuff carried in the daily press throughout the country since March 1915. They have resorted to anything necessary to commercialize public sentiment and sandbag the National Congress into making extravagant and wasteful appropriations for the Army and Navy under the false pretense that it was necessary. Their stock argument is that it is patriotism. They are playing on every prejudice and passion of American people. You see, the fact of the matter is, whether people want to try to deny it, it is in the congressional records themselves. The purpose of J.P. Morgan buying up those 25 national newspapers, and that they were considered indeed the most powerful, the most influential of all the newspapers in America, and that J.P. Morgan and his family to this very day own and control those newspapers. And trust me, they were used to affect and change our minds and policies, especially when it came to military preparedness and other things that the Illuminati wanted us to start leaning towards and started believing in. Now, it's very interesting. If we go back and check other records, there was a very interesting remark made by John S. Swinton. Now, John S. Swinton was one of the most preeminent New York journalists in history. And at a particular banquet in which he was honored, and this was back in 1880, someone had stood up and offered a toast to John S. Swinton and to the press. Now, this person didn't know who Swinton was on site, and he had no idea really what was going to happen, because the man's toast offered up to John Swinton also reflected a toast to the independent press. So this is what John S. Swinton himself said on independent press. There is no such thing as an independent press in America if we accept that of little country towns. You know this, and I know it. Not a man among you dares to utter his honest opinion. Were you to utter it, you know beforehand that it would never appear in print. I am paid $150 a week, back then that was a fortune, so that I may keep my honest opinions out of the newspapers for which I write. You too are paid similar salaries for similar services. Were I to admit that a single edition of my newspaper contained an honest opinion, my occupation, like Othello's, would be gone in less than 24 hours. The man who was so foolish as to write his honest opinion would be on the streets in search of another job. It is the duty of the New York journalist to lie, to distort, to revile, to toady at the feet of mammon, and to sell his country and his race for his daily bread, or what amounts to the same thing, his salary. We are the tools and the vassals of the rich behind the scenes. We are marionettes. These men pull the strings and we dance. Our time, our talents, our lives, our capacities are all the property of these men. We are intellectual prostitutes. And he's right. And that goes on to this very day. I have spoken to a number of colleagues and friends who were journalists in newspapers throughout the country and in other parts of the world. And they told me, and I've asked them honestly, you know, are you allowed to give your perspective on whatever it is you were examining? In other words, is the paper still allowing an unbiased perspective, and are you being objectionable as a writer? And I've been told in no uncertain terms that they are told, quite literally, what their slant on whatever article it was that whatever news they went out to get and articles was written, they were told what slant they would take, and they were told generally how they would write it and who it would favor. And of course, this is always double-checked and verified through the editor of the newspaper. So these people, to this very day, they are not allowed their own opinion. There's no objectivity. They are told what perspective they will take, what articles they will write, and of course, all the editors will make sure that that's exactly how it happens. In order to get more control over the United States, the Illuminati needed to start setting up their own front organizations here. Now, the first one that they had established was the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, in England. Here in America, they needed to start the same thing. Many people have heard, of course, about the Council on Foreign Relations. It is the first front organization that the Illuminati had established here in the United States of America. And this was just 2 years after the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Among other things, the Council on Foreign Relations, I should say, have their own magazines put out on a monthly basis. The first one is called Foreign Affairs. This is what they put out, generally speaking, and literally speaking, it covers a number of different topics. You know, national and international news, policies, things of that general thinking. What I want you to do, and we'll get back to this, but just take note of this little logo of theirs. It doesn't look like much right now, but we will get back to that. Now, the Council on Foreign Relations claim that they, you know, are not making policies, they're not trying to push their beliefs and other things, you know, and this is what all of them will tell you. You know, this is the constant, you know, theme that they will try to drum into our heads. Or we're just, you know, a group of citizens concerned for the affairs of the world. And it's a lot more than that, that's for sure. Because in the 15th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, Volume 4, page 877, this is what they say about Foreign Affairs, you know, the magazine itself. Foreign Affairs, Journal of International Relations, published in New York City 5 times a year, one of the most prestigious periodicals of its kind in the world. It is the organ of the Council on Foreign Relations, by which it was founded in 1922, and is informally the voice of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. It has a world reputation for its careful and probing analysis of political, economic, and social developments in the world scene. The contributors of these authoritative and scholarly articles comprise a roster of the nation's most distinguished journalists, scholars, and statesmen. Now here's where it gets very interesting. Ideas put forward tentatively in this journal often, if well received by the foreign affairs community, appears later as U.S. policy or legislation. Prospective policies that fill this test usually disappear. Yes, these people who claim, well, we're just, you know, a body of interested, concerned citizen, and that, you know, we're just bouncing ideas, and that, you know, we're not trying to make anyone do anything. Even, you know, the Encyclopedia Britannica realizes and understands these people are affecting U.S. policy. That's what these articles are all about. Foreign Affairs magazine is affecting, whether anyone wants to admit it or not, because if you study this very carefully, the articles written in them, you will find whether they are becoming U.S. policy or not. Now, interesting enough, remember this little logo up here I told you folks to take a look at? What we're going to do, and what I have done, is blown it up so you could get a good look at what the official logo of the Foreign Affairs magazine is, which is the Council on Foreign Relations. And if you take a good look, you can see it is the pale rider upon the pale horse. And we found this in the earliest part of the DVD pertaining to the book of Revelation when we were speaking about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, interesting enough, you look at the bottom of it, it has a word, it looks like it's saying V-B-I-Q-V-E, but you have to understand Latin. V is used, back then, was used for both the letter V and U. You see, if you replace the V's and make them U's as they should be done, it comes out to be the word ubiqua. Ubiqua is where, of course, we get the word ubiquitous or ubiquitous from. Ubiq means to be ever present. It also, when you're being ubiquitous, it has the sense of being everywhere. This is what the Illuminati believe about themselves. Remember, in earlier DVDs in this series, we talk about how they believe that they are all-knowing, all-powerful, and everywhere. This is only just another reflection of their belief system, but interesting enough how they themselves, again, reflect the biblical prophecies which we had earlier discussed. Behold the pale rider. Bearing in mind, we just showed the official logo of the Council on Foreign Relations to be that of the pale rider upon the pale horse, as found in Revelation chapter 6, verse 2. I want you to take just a little trip with me back in history. Now, if you recall, earlier in this DVD series, we had talked about the origins of the House of Rothschild. We know that Maya Angelou Rothschild, whose original name was Bauer, but he later changed it to Rothschild, was a money lender. And he had an interesting shield that he had hung out over his store, like other stores of those day and age, which would identify this shop as being his shop and that this is where you would come to borrow money, because Maya Angelou Bauer was a money lender. Now, this shield is this red shield that I'm holding up right now. Now, from the High German, the last name Rothschild literally means red shield. This is how they came up with the shield. When they changed their last name to Rothschild, they made sure that their shield reflected that name. Now, what's very interesting is if you will take a good look of the center of this shield, because you will see another shield within it. Dead center, you will note once again that there is a pale rider upon the pale horse. And when we compare this to the official logo of the Council on Foreign Relations, you will notice once again these are interrelated. This is, for the Council on Foreign Relations, the pale rider upon the pale horse. And if you note very carefully, this pale rider of the Council on Foreign Relations is holding his arm high up in a victory salute. And if we compare that to the pale rider upon the pale horse on the official family seal, the shield of the House of Rothschild, you will notice that pale rider upon the pale horse is also holding his arm up in a victory salute. And this was prophesied that there would be, symbolically speaking, a pale horse coming with three other horses, or what's known as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, as I stated before, J.P. Morgan, who is a member of the Order of the Illuminati and had been all the way to his death and his family had taken over, bought up 25 of the 179 major newspapers of his day and age. You see, the media is directly interconnected with the Council on Foreign Relations because the Council of Foreign Relations is trying to affect and control the policies of America through the newspapers. And one of the most solid piece of evidence we can use to prove this point is right here. You will note that all these newspapers, television shows, and everything, the key members are all members of the Council on Foreign Relations. We find out that CBS, NBC, and the Children's Television Workshop, the major people in that form of media are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. When we get to various newspapers and such, or newspaper personalities and other people of various means of media, we find out over here that there are people like Ted Koppel, Diane Sawyer, Barbara Walters, Bill Moyers, Dan Rathers, and others, Harry Reasners, are all members of the Council on Foreign Relations. The evidence is self-proclaiming. And if you don't believe me, you can easily look this up, ladies and gentlemen. These people were at one time and have been members of the Council on Foreign Relations. So the connection between the control of the newspaper and the media into that of the Council on Foreign Relations is obvious. And to this very day, it is also known and commonly expressed that the Council on Foreign Relations is the sister organization of the Royal Institute of International Affairs at Chatham House. The Council on Foreign Relations is nothing but a duplicate of that other organization, except it's here on American soil instead of English soil. Now, I want you to take a look at this gentleman here. This was the Prime Minister of Canada, William Aberhart. He was in power from August 17, 1930 through August 23, 1935. And he himself was very fearful of an event that the Illuminati had been trying to thrust onto America and onto those people who were subjects of the British Crown. He gave a warning in a broadcast back in 1943, and I want you to listen to just part of the warning he had given. Listen carefully, ladies and gentlemen. For the past 3 years, in fact, ever since the outbreak of war, the Second World War, there has been a steady stream of propaganda, carefully organized and well-financed, to win support of setting up a World Federation of Nations under an international authority to which all nations would surrender control of finance, international trade, their armed forces, and their citizenship rights. How long is it going to take for the people to realize what is going on and what it will mean to them? Now it is the time to act. If we wait until the bonds are welded and this dreadful totalitarian order set up, the people of Canada will then be helpless to do anything about it if they do not like the harsh conditions that are imposed upon them. Remember that, in addition to control over finance, the international authority would also have control over the armed forces and citizenship rights. If any individual dared to challenge the authority of the international dictatorship, he might find that they had deprived him of his citizenship rights. And if the people as a whole started to kick over the traces, well, they would be unarmed and helpless, while the international overlords would have control of all the armed forces and the world police force. So it would be just too bad for the people. And I think you know where I'm going to be going with this, ladies and gentlemen. As we end this section of the DVD, we're going to next be going into the United Nations, and we're going to be taking a good look to see how they are connected to the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations. On September 17, 1796, President George Washington, in his farewell speech, warned us never to form any type of permanent alliance with Europe and to stay away from any of her problems. He knew we would regret it eventually if we did. Unfortunately, we did not heed his advice. However, this photo is Andrew Carnegie. Now, Andrew Carnegie was a man responsible for creating what's known as the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. But trust me, ladies and gentlemen, this is just another one of those ruses that the Illuminati has gotten us caught up in. Now, interesting enough, at the actual headquarters of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as you can see here, a lot of things had been going on. One thing in particular, and once again, I want to read from the records so you people can exactly see what's been going on all along. Now, there's a testimony that was done by Norman Dodd, who was the director of the committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations of the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, the committee members of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace was asked the following question. Now, listen carefully to this. If it is desirable to alter the life of an entire people, is there any means more efficient than war? A strange question if you ask me, considering Carnegie's Endowment for International Peace was tax exempt, but they were just supposed to be a tax exempt organization, that's it, if that's all they were. A year later, they came back with the following answer. They spent an entire year researching this question. If it is desirable to alter the life of an entire people, is there any means more efficient than war? They answered that question like this. There are no known means more efficient than war, assuming the objective is altering the life of an entire people. And it's true. Let's look at recent events with 9/11. Everyone has rallied around the flag of patriotism because of what had happened to the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. And as a result, we've been thrust into war. Literally speaking, it was made to appear as if it was our idea. We were made to look, like victims that were horrified at what had happened. And as a result, the president, President Bush at the time, rallied us around the flag, and now, 8 years later, we're still at war with Afghanistan and Iraq. During the early part of the 20th century, the Illuminati had established the Royal Institute of International Affairs in England and the Council on Foreign Relations here in America. But they needed to extend, as I stated before, this power on a global level. The world had become smaller since World War I, and now they needed to extend it. But let's go back to those events shortly before World War I to see how they would lead up to what would eventually be called the United Nations. Now, this is a picture of Colonel Edward Mandell House. Now, Colonel House was, among other things, one of the most influential people over Woodrow Wilson and eventually Rockefeller. But his main influence was over Woodrow Wilson. And Colonel House had written a book called Philip Drew, Administrator. Now, the key points in this book, and I want you to listen very carefully to what the key points in his book, Philip Drew, Administrator, pointed out. In his book, Now, Philip Drew is the main character who would eventually become the president. But in it, it says, Philip Drew, I should say, excuse me, Philip Drew was the one behind the scenes who would be manipulating the president. Philip Drew was a behind-the-scenes manipulator of political figures. Number 2, a group of insiders would cause a depression. Number 3, the same group of insiders would pre-select the next president whose name was Rockland. Number 4, the new president would have fireside chats. Number 5, President Rockland would create a program called the New Era, which would give the government more control over the people. Number 6, the insiders would also weaken the country to such a state that civil war would seem imminent. And number 7, because of the threat of civil war, the insiders propelled President Rockland into becoming the established dictator of the world. Now, for those of you who have ever read Philip Drew, Administrator, you can easily tell that it's a very thinly veiled story pertaining to those events between Colonel House and Woodrow Wilson. Now, during this time, during the early 1900s, J.P. Morgan, I'm sure you remember, we've already discussed J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan had been called to London on a number of times by the Rothschild family. You see, they needed to set up a new front organization. For those of you who have read Philip Drew, Administrator, you will recognize it as a thinly veiled, disguised relationship between Colonel Edward Mandell House and President Woodrow Wilson. Now, when we compare the two, we find out that President Wilson is manipulated by Colonel House, just as Philip Drew had manipulated the president in that book. There was a depression of October 29th, 1929, the big one that had happened. That was the 5th one, as I recall, that was the 5th one in America that had happened, and that was the biggest one in history. The president was pre-selected. Wilson and others would be pre-selected through Colonel Edward Mandell House, just like Philip Drew had pre-selected their presidents. Wilson did have fireside chats, just like President Rockland did in Philip Drew, Administrator. President Rockland had the New Era. Wilson had the New Deal. The nation would be thrust to the point of almost entering into civil war, which weakened it terribly. And in reality, the Federal Reserve Act weakened America to where we ended up in a Great Depression. And Philip Drew was going to end up as the new world dictator. President Wilson, by just a hair, did not become the world dictator. I will show you, as we go along, how he almost really did become the very first dictator of our world. Now, before these events, shortly before this, the Federal Reserve Act had been passed, but it did not just come in like that. The Illuminati, their people here in the United States, had tried many, many times to set up a central bank. And if you remember, on a previous DVD in this series, we find out that there's only 7 nations now that do not have a Rothschild central bank controlling them. Well, anyways, the Federal Reserve Act needed to be passed, and they were hoping to pass it sooner, but it was from 1908 to 1912, I believe it was, William Howard Taft that was in office, and he had, just to paraphrase it, told all the people in his cabinet, don't even dare to present something like that on my desk because I'll veto it immediately. See, he, like a number of other presidents, had realized you put a central bank in America, we lose control of ourselves at this point. We are now in the hands of the bankers. Well, so anyways, once the Federal Reserve had been passed, there was a number of mergers of multinational banks, such as the Chase Manhattan Bank, the National City Bank of New York, and the Manhattan Bank. They were all beginning to merge into one big conglomeration. Now, this didn't happen overnight. You see, in 1907, J.P. Morgan had met with the Rothschilds in London and in France on a number of meetings. Plans were being laid out that would cause Wall Street to have a major panic in 1907. And this would, destabilize, if you would, America's faith in the economy, and that something had to be done through the government that would help control and regulate our money. Now, of course, we all know that this eventually would become known as the Federal Reserve System. But there was absolutely nothing federal about it, and it is definitely not controlled by the federal government, nor has it anything to do with the federal government. These are 12 banks which are independently owned. They are a central bank. They're made up of 12 banks, and they're the ones that control and issue the money of the United States. Now, interesting enough, as far as I remember, under the Constitution, only Congress is supposed to have the power to coin money. Yet, the people of America had been tricked into believing it was still the government that was doing it, because they labeled these central banks the Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Reserve Banks. This is how they tricked us into accepting it, because supposedly it's something federal. It has nothing to do with the government. It has everything to do with the Rothschilds and all the financial barons that bow down to them. Now, the Federal Reserve banking system is run by 7 members, and each of them served for 14 years. So every 14 years, you can expect that these people are either going to be re-elected into their position, or someone else from one of the banking world or under the control of the Rothschilds and the Illuminati is going to take over. Now, let's just bring this up just a little further. That was back in 1913. December 14th, 1914, England had been thrust into war because of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Okay? He would be, he was going to be, I should say, the Prince of Austria-Hungary. But it never happened because he had been assassinated. Now, this was enough to cause many of the nations in Europe to enter into a war. But that was on European soil. America did not get involved, at least not at first, because during his bid for the presidency in 1912, Woodrow Wilson promised he would never allow America to get involved in a war that was over in Europe. And supposedly, it did appear as if he kept his promise. But there was a lot more going on at the time. You see, at that time, during 1914, England had decoded all the codes of Germany. They knew where their U-boats were going to be at any given time. They had known all the positions and everything. Now, the First Lord of the Admiralty of England at that time was a young man who would eventually become the Prime Minister of England. And at this point, he's known as the First Lord of the Admiralty, and that would Be Winston Churchill. Now, there was going to have to be some excuse, some mechanism that the Illuminati could trick Americans into getting involved into a world war. What they did, they had sent the SS Lusitania from England over to America. Now, the SS Lusitania had been a regular luxury liner owned by Cunard Lines. It was, as I said, a regular luxury liner. As a matter of fact, it was one of the biggest ones for its day and age. And, well, it had been sent over here to America. And unbeknownst to the passengers at the time, J.P. Morgan, and there's that name again, had received orders after visiting with the Rothschilds in London and France for a number of meetings. Once the boat had docked, 600 million rounds of ammunition had been loaded onto the SS Lusitania, along with 600 tons of explosives. Now, it was J.P. Morgan himself who owned all that ammunition. Somehow, the Germans found out about this. And they had actually printed in American newspapers a warning for American citizens not to get on the SS Lusitania. You see, the Germans did not want Americans to get involved in World War I. They were well aware of the power that America wielded, not just politically, but also militarily. And they did not want us to get involved. So they put a warning trying to get anyone who was trying to get onto, the SS Lusitania, not to get on it. There was warnings because they said that there was a high chance that the ship would be fired upon. Now, some of the old photos I have found, this one would be the captain of the SS Lusitania. And he had no idea, I'm sure, that when the SS Lusitania had arrived in America, that the ship would eventually be destroyed. And a number of the passengers, of course, had been brought on board. They did not worry about the warnings from Germany. They just assumed that that was just some German propaganda going on, and that the ship, being the largest one on the ocean, I believe at that time, well, they felt as safe as you could possibly be, and you could see even the lifeboats and everything as you're going down, the ship itself. And here is a photo of the SS Lusitania as it pulled out of New York Harbor. And you can see all the Model Ts, Model Ford Ts, whatever they were called back then, all lined up, people there just waiting them on and everything. Now, remember, at this time, Admiral Winston Churchill had known exactly where every German U-boat had been stationed. If there was one in the English Channel, he would be aware of it. There's absolutely no way he couldn't be. They had broken the German code. They knew where every ship was. Now, on May 7, 1915, when the SS Lusitania was getting close to England, a boat known as the Juno had been stationed in, well, we call it the pond. I can't remember what the English Channel, and it was supposed to meet up with the SS Lusitania and escort her in. She never did. She received orders while she was in the English Channel to turn around and just get back into harbor. And at first that made no sense at all, unless you knew what was going to happen. Here's a photo of an old German postcard And this postcard was used as propaganda because it shows where the first torpedo that hit the SS Lusitania had struck. And of course, this was the German captain who had attacked the SS Lusitania and sunk it. 1,201 lives were lost at sea because of what the Illuminati was planning on doing. They were going to try to get America thrust into war. And when you have 600 million rounds of ammunition along with 600 tons of explosives, you could literally hit this ship anywhere and it was going to go up. This was simply the act of the Illuminati to thrust us into World War I. But it never happened. Unfortunately, the only thing that did happen were mass graves where they buried the bodies that could and could not be identified once they washed ashore after the SS Lusitania had been sunk. During the 1916 presidential election, Woodrow Wilson once again promised he would not allow America to get involved in a war. And unfortunately, it didn't happen. You see, once we became involved in World War I, and this would have been back in April 2nd, 1917, when Wilson called for the declaration of war, America, unfortunately, was set up eventually to end up with the United Nations. It wasn't the United Nations at first, it was known as the League of Nations. But at the end of World War I, this is President Woodrow Wilson, who was coming back from the meeting where the Versailles Treaty had been signed. Now, if you look at the Versailles Treaty and read it carefully, there was absolutely no way Germany was not going to get involved in another war. You look at the way it was written, I mean, you could easily tell that within 20 years, Germany would end up in another war. The punishments, the reparations for war damages and so on and so forth, it was absolutely crippling. If Germany allowed themselves to stay in that state, they would end up no better than a third world nation. And they would not allow that to happen. Now, as I said before, President Wilson was planning, along with his friends, Colonel Edwin Mandell House, the Rothschilds and such, on creating what would back then be called the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations was, as I said, the predecessor to the United Nations. It had been hoped that once America had been thrust into World War I, and once it had been over and done with, America and her representatives would see the necessity for having a global community, for putting the whole world under one organization that would be controlled through this organization. This organization was to be known as the League of Nations. Now, by the time January 10th, 1920 had come about, the League of Nations, and just about every nation involved in it, had signed it and ratified it. Wilson had been pushing for this along with his friends ever since he became elected. They had to go through the Federal Reserve Act so that they could cause a panic in America, so that eventually this panic would lead us into getting involved in World War I through the sinking of the SS Lusitania, because rally around the flag, boys, against were doing it in the name of patriotism. And by the time all this was said and done, the charter was ready for Wilson to sign. All he had to do at this point was walk into Congress and have them ratify it. That's it. The last step after all these years of planning and all his efforts done by President Wilson had finally come about. He was going to walk into Congress, and as far as he was concerned, and he was supremely confident that Congress was now going to sign and ratify the League of Nations Charter, and that he himself would end up as the very first global dictator. But it didn't happen. For all the work, all their scheming, all their planning, all their manipulating, the Illuminati was not able to get Wilson elected as the first world dictator because Congress did not sign the Treaty of Versailles. You see, there was still a number of good people with good consciences, enough to make sure that such a thing couldn't happen. They saw the imminent danger of such an event, and they refused to allow it to happen. I am convinced that President Wilson walked out of there totally dejected, because after working on this eventual event for almost 10 years, he just must have been beaming when he walked in. But he left with nothing. He did not become the first global dictator as Philip Drew, administrator, had predicted. They had everything else, but he was not able to end up as the world dictator. Now, since the League of Nations was a bust, the Illuminati was going to have to do something else to propel America into accepting the League of Nations, if not under another name. Now, what's interesting is Professor Carroll Quigley, who wrote Tragedy and Hope, had stated the following on President Wilson. Now, President Wilson is quoted as saying this: Mr. House, speaking of Colonel Edward Mandell House, Mr. House is my second personality. He is my independent self. His thoughts are mine, are one. If I were in his place, I would do just as he suggested. You see, this is how much influence Colonel Edward Mandell House had over Wilson, just like Philip Drew had all that influence over their president, Rockland. You just compare these events to Philip Drew, administrator, and you will see that they line up perfectly. There is absolutely no difference. As I said before, it's just a thinly veiled story that shows what they were planning on doing. Excuse me. Now, how were they going to get their League of Nations? It wouldn't happen for at least another 20 years down the road. But again, according to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, their findings point to the conclusion that there is nothing that will change the nation mind of a people better than war. Nothing will do it more efficiently. And so, once again, the Illuminati called for a war. This would be the second World War that we would see. And interesting enough, and I will show you this on another DVD, we don't have time to get into it now, how it was the second head of the Order of the Illuminati, Giuseppe Mazzini, along with General Albert Pike, who would eventually become the head of the southern jurisdiction of all Masonry, how it was them two in collaboration, how they came up with the three plans, three different World War wars, and what they would involve. So far, the first two are dead on. The third one, which they called for, it's lining up exactly as they stated. But as I said, we will get onto that in another DVD. But at the end of World War II, which that would be, well, it was June 26, 1943, in which the United Nations came into existence. Once again, after the world had come out of another war, the Illuminati pushed for a centralized body in which the nations would come together, and supposedly we'd be able to handle things through peace talks and all this. We wouldn't get involved in war, and that the United Nations, as it was called, would be the implement through which world wars and other wars would be forever prevented. And as far as my history books tell me, and from what I've seen, the United Nations haven't stopped one war in all of their history. But that's what they're supposed to do. It was on October 24th, 1949, that the United Nations had established their charter. Now, part of the preamble of the charter of the United Nations reads as follows: "We, the peoples of the United Nations, declare to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith and fundamental human rights in the dignity and worth of the human person, and the equal rights of men and women out of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedoms." And it goes on and on and on. Now, the interesting thing about this, every nation sent representatives to be represented, obviously, at the United Nations. Our own government, the United States, sent 47 representatives to the United Nations, and every single one of them were from the Council on Foreign Relations. This is how they became directly interconnected with the United Nations. Now, interesting thing about the United Nations, and here's a photo of it. The land here upon which the United Nations rests was donated by the Rockefellers. But what is even more interesting is that before the United Nations had even been erected there, what was standing there before was a slaughterhouse. That's where they would, kill animals and process their meat for people to eat. I mean, can you think of the millions of gallons of blood that was spilt on that soil before the United Nations had taken it over? And in the occult world to this very day, that is how they make their lands sacred. They actually sanctify their grounds through blood. But we know the Bible tells us as Christians we're supposed to sanctify our holy grounds with oil. In the occult world, they're doing it with blood. And with the United Nations, considering there was already tens of millions of blood spilt on that ground, it was ripe for the Illuminati to take. The first Secretary General of the United Nations was Alger Hiss. Now, by all accounts, Alger Hiss was a very likable individual. He was always in with the big crowds of people who had all the inside tracks and information. They had always said he was a well-dressed individual. He just looked sharp. He just was one of those people that you just couldn't help like. And this is Alger Hiss here. And standing next to him is one of his inside buddies, which was Edward Stettinius, who at the time was the Secretary of State. What no one knew about Alger Hiss at the time was that he was a communist. It wouldn't become obvious until this gentleman, Whittaker Chamber, had reported this, and this is Whittaker Chamber at the congressional hearing on Alger Hiss and espionage back in 1948. And who was really pushing for this communist exposure of Hiss and certain other people was an unknown California congressman who would eventually become the President of the United States, Richard Nixon. And I think it's really prophetical how it says, "I think Hiss is lying." And this would be the same charge leveled at Nixon at the Watergate scandal during his administration. And here is, taking his oath before the congressional hearing, was Alger Hiss. It would later on be proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Hiss was indeed a communist, along with quite a number of other individuals. And it would be this gentleman here who would push for all those other communists to be brought out. This is Congressman Carroll B. Reese. He was from Tennessee, and he was told, you know, he was the one really pushing to have others aside from Hiss exposed. Now, what was interesting about this was you would think that the headlines would have been blaring about all of this communist exposure and what was going on. But you have to remember, the major newspapers of America had already been under J.P. Morgan's control. They literally painted that poor congressman in the worst light imaginable. They just made it look as if he had nothing better else to do in this life than to sully the names of other people who, as far as they were concerned, there was no evidence about them being communists. It didn't take long for that Congressman Reese to just pull out and get away from the entire situation. This, he saw literally the writings on the wall, and he did not want his, political figure just to vanish overnight. Now, United Nations have their hands literally in so many different areas that it would take quite a long list for me to just show you exactly all the things the United Nations have done. Now, one of the things that they have created is what's known as biospheres. Now, a biosphere, generally speaking, is an area of land or a reserve that's been put aside because there's some type of natural thing about it that the world wants to preserve, or at least we're told the world wants to preserve. Now, let me just show you some of these biospheres. And this is very important, ladies and gentlemen, especially in light of the prophecies in the book of Revelation. Now, here is a list of where all the biospheres in the United States, can be located. If you just take a careful look at this map and just find your own state, well, you should be able to see if there's one of the 47 UN biospheres here that at least is in your area. Now, at first, it doesn't look like there's much to it. However, if you remember, when we played the game Connect the Dots, just like we did with the seals of the United States of America and the maps of Washington, D.C., we saw a lot more than what the eye would normally catch. You see, when we take a look at all the biospheres in the United States and start connecting the dots, you will note very carefully that there are corridors in between those biospheres. And this is important to note because you see, no one is allowed on these biospheres without permission. If you are caught on them, you can actually be shot on sight, legally. When the Illuminati, and I am convinced of this, when it is time for the Illuminati or whoever it is that's supposed to take over the world, when it is time for that to happen, they're going to have a way of controlling us, where we're living, where we can move, and all this, and how they could also prevent people from escaping. These corridors are a perfect means of keeping people under control, because if you dare cross any of those borders, you will be shot on sight. And that is a very effective means of controlling people. You threaten to kill them, I guarantee you most people are going to step away like that. What's even more frightening to me is that globally speaking, we now have 411 biospheres. And if you take a good look, it seems a good number, if not maybe half of them, is located along the shorelines. You see, this way, they can also prevent you from leaving the continent through boats if you try to get through their biospheres. Because at that point, legally, they can then shoot you on sight. Now, the official logo, and this is a United Nations thing now, the official logo for man in the biosphere, which are these biosphere reserves, is right here. It's MAB, Man and Biosphere. But I think even if you have just a smidgen of occult knowledge, you can see something's wrong, because right here is what is commonly known in the occult world as the Ankh. This is the Egyptian Ankh. It is the symbol for reincarnation. And on the United Nations plaques for the biospheres, and you can see it right here, every single biosphere has that symbol. It has the occult symbol of reincarnation, which is the main religious belief in the Illuminati. You see, they don't believe that they're going to die and go to heaven or hell. They believe that they are going to come back through the act of reincarnation only to continue their plans. When thinking about United Nations biosphere reserves, I want you to remember a couple things. First of all, these biospheres, which are on American soil, supposedly no longer belong to us. They belong to the United Nations because they are supposed to be protected areas of lands, such as national parks and national wonders, things like that. So if you try to take a step on them, as I said before, without permission, you can be shot on sight or arrested, and this is a wonderful way that they're going to control us. Now, an interesting notation in the Encyclopedia Britannica on the United Nations goes as follows. United Nations, international organization established by charter on October 24, 1945, with the purposes of maintaining international peace and security, developing friendly relations among nations on the principle of equal rights and self-determination, and encouraging international cooperation in solving international economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian problems. So you see, by their own words, the United Nations literally are trying to tell the world how to run themselves economically, socially, and when you get into this, into an in-depth analysis of the United Nations, you'll find out that they also are interfering in people's religious freedoms. Now, related to these biosphere is an event that happened back in June 5th, 1992. It was known as the Convention on Biological Diversity, and this was held in Rio de Janeiro. Now, one person you need to know who was there, who we will be discussing very shortly, was Bill Clinton. When thinking about the United Nations biospheres, there is a direct connection between those and a particular event that happened on June 5th, 1992. This is to document the full text of what's known as the Convention on Biological Diversity, and this was held, as I stated, on June 5th, 1992, and this was at Rio de Janeiro. Now, 1 year later, almost to the day, on June 4th, 1993, this was signed by the United Nations. And what is very important to note, and we will get into this shortly, is that one person in particular was in attendance, and that was Bill Clinton, who would become the president thanks to this and his cooperation. There are many different things in this document. Really, there's just so much that it just can't be done without making another presentation. But the one thing I want you to take a look at, and it's very, very important. The end conclusion, the objective of the entire biodiversity treaty is this. And I want you to take a good look at it. It says it right here. The objective of this entire program and document states to make nature worship a state religion. The entire objective of the Treaty on Biological Diversity is only one, and that is to make nature worship a state religion. It's right there, ladies and gentlemen. This is it. This is the final objective of the entire document and of their plans. They want to make nature worship, or what you know to be called witchcraft, the new state religion. And this is exactly what is prophesied in the book of Revelation in chapter 18, verse 23b. It says, and I quote, "For by thy sorceries were all nations deceived." It is through the occult that the entire world is going to be handed over to the Antichrist. This is the new religion, according to the Bible. The Biodiversity Treaty, as bad as it is, should make every single Christian aware of what's going on, and that the United Nations is nothing but another front organization for the Illuminati. They claim that they are an organization of peace, and they're trying to bring international peace and prosperity to the world. How many of you remember the event of Katanga, when the United Nations sent in their troops and the hospitals and other things were being bombed? That's hardly humanitarian. But the one thing that really infuriated me happened back in 1993 in Somalia. We were supposed to be going over there, helping the Somalians out, restoring peace and all this. The whole operation through the United Nations was called Operation Restore Hope. Now, let me show you one photo first. Okay, this is not one of the best photos I was able to get, but this is a Somali child that was forced to drink a containment that had salt water, vomit, and worms in it. This child was actually being punished for not giving over information that the United Nations thought that he had. Now, on these next photos, ladies and gentlemen, if you do have little children at home, I'm going to ask you to pause the tape here and make sure they don't see these next couple of photos. Quite honestly, I was torn into deciding whether I should show these photos or not, because some of them are quite brutal. But if you're going to see the truth about what's going on with the United Nations, I determined then that these photos must be shown. You need to see them if you really think the United Nations is all that and then some. Here's a couple of UN soldiers who's holding this 15-year-old child over a burning flames. Now, if you look at the photo carefully, you can see those flames are only about a foot away from the entire backside of this poor child. They literally are roasting this child alive for information. This is just a 15-year-old boy that the UN is torturing in an operation that they call Restore Hope. This next this next photo, now at the bottom, it might be a little difficult to see. As I said, some of these photos were difficult to blow up, but here's the head of the child, his shoulders, his body, and everything. These soldiers had been torturing this particular child here. This one here, as far as my memory tells me, I believe he was already dead at this point. But you can see right here the familiar blue helmet of the United Nations. These next two, ladies and gentlemen, just prepare yourselves. This is a 16-year-old boy who would be tortured by United Nations soldiers in Operation Restore Hope. Now remember, this is just a 16-year-old boy. This is not this is not a photo you need your kids to see, but you need to see it anyways. This poor child, and you can see all the blood, that is his own blood around him, had been tortured at this point for hours by not just this UN soldiers, but by others. They were trying to get information out of this 16-year-old boy. By the time the night had passed by, this 16-year-old boy, his frail little body couldn't take it any longer. By the time the daylight had come, the boy was dead. Literally, UN soldiers, under the banner of Operation Restore Hope, had beaten and tortured this child to death. And the UN claims, just like they did with the Katanga incident, that they're there to secure international peace and hope for everyone. Well, this is not exactly my idea of going about it. When looking at the logo of the United Nations, it's actually made up of 3 different symbols. And you have to understand how these symbols are broken down and what they represent. You can see surrounding the UN symbol is the laurel wreath. Now the laurel wreath comes from the Roman times, and it literally means victory. Over here would be the planet Earth. Over here is what's known as the eightfold path of witchcraft, or the wheel of life, in the occult world. It is these same 8 spokes, if you remember, we had already mentioned in another part of this DVD series, that represents the 8 nights of human sacrifice. Literally speaking, the United States logo translates into the following: victory over the world through the occult. Again, this is what the Bible prophesies would happen. And it would be under, eventually, a 10 kingdom nation. 10 kingdoms of the world, I should say. Before I wrap this up, I want to read to you something I had found in a daily newspaper. It's dated September 15, 2009. It's the Beatrice daily paper. It talks about how Khrushchev had one time was going through United States, was invited over to the United States, and he was looking at different places and such, and basically just giving a tour. And during the tour, Khrushchev had remarked to Secretary Benson that communism would eventually consume democracy. Now, Benson replied, of course, that America would never accept anything like that. Khrushchev replied, however, that it wouldn't be something that happened overnight. It would be something that would gradually happen, one thing at a time. Now, if you look at the beliefs of communism and compare it to the belief system of Illuminism, you'll find out that they are one and the same, that there is no disagreement. And that's because it was the Illuminati who set up Lenin and communism to succeed. Now, the rest of this article goes like this. Think about this. How many of you or your children and grandchildren have to provide birth certificates to participate in district play in American Legion baseball, for example? We have a man sitting in the White House who still hasn't proved he's eligible to run for the presidency. Barack Obama, in case you don't know it. But he's there. And through smooth talk and deception, he's dismantling our rights. Our freedoms are being eroded like an icicle in a hot desert wind. Perhaps Khrushchev's words were prophetic after all. And this article was written and submitted by Lynn Shulesky. He's right. Lynn Shulesky is absolutely right. Slowly but surely, one step at a time, our rights are being eroded. Our Constitution literally is on the verge of just being thrown out. And I remember the days when I was in the Illuminati, how they already had plans for a new Constitution to replace our old one. Now, as I said before, one thing you must take note of when looking at the Treaty on Biodiversity that was done in Rio de Janeiro was that Bill Clinton was in attendance, and he would eventually become the president because of this and because of his cooperation with the Biodiversity Treaty. And without belaboring this point anymore,